Well, happy Monday. I don't know about you, but I'm really hoping that this past weekend was the last bit of our snowfall. So it's actually feeling pretty nice outside, and I'm hoping that trend continues for the foreseeable future. This past week, we talked about ethnocentrism in the early church. We used Acts 15 to talk about how the gospel brings together groups who would normally be separated by ethnic, cultural distinctives or differences. And I talked about the distinctions between ethnocentrism and racism and why I prefer the term ethnocentrism to racism, because it's found in the Bible, the word ethne, and we as Christians are commanded to go in Matthew 28, go into all the ethnes, make disciples of all ethnes in the world. So it was a weighty topic, and I think part of the reason that this conversation is so difficult is because we're not used to being uncomfortable. Now, if you look at the world around us, most of the time everything we do is meant to bring ease or comfort or convenience to all of us. So if I pull up my phone right now, I can get an app that will help me get a ride anywhere I want, anytime I want, with just a couple button presses. I've done this. I can get food delivered to my house from a restaurant or even groceries as long as the places are open. And if it takes too long, then I can even lodge a complaint with the company and potentially get the driver fired for this. Now, the problem is I think there's a tendency to at times bring that idea of or goal of comfort into the church. And the church is actually meant to at times make us uncomfortable and push us. Now, you think about it, how do you grow? You grow by being stretched intellectually, emotionally, physically. We all are aware of this. So the series that we're looking at in Whose Image has been very deep. So there's a lot of content that I'm throwing at you. There are a lot of big words that we are using, and there's some really weighty ideas that we're trying to deal with in some detail. Now, one of the questions that came up in the Q&A time this past Sunday was application oriented. So I get what you're saying, but what does this mean in practice? And part of the difficulty is in so many of these conversations, the application has to be very specific and contextualized. So you need to ask questions like, how close is your relationship? How much do you know the history, their personal history? How comfortable is the person that you're talking with it being pushed back at some of their ideas? So my goal with this series is to try to make us just a little more aware of how we should be thinking through and engaging these issues. So for example, last week we looked at what I hope was a framework, a way to approach the gender and sexuality questions. This week was the framework. How do we think and approach race or ethnic questions? Now remember, the foundation for this that we need to be building from is the image of God. That leads us to then we are all sinners by nature and by choice, which means all of us tend to create others and then disassociate ourselves from that other group, leading to conflict or fighting. Again, none of these things that are going on in our world should be surprising to us. Now, my approach, what I talked about, this listen, lament, learn, and love, is a conglomeration from a whole bunch of different stuff I've been studying, reading, and learning from over the past 6+ months. Now, at the end of this video, I'll share a number of resources that I have found personally to be helpful as a starting point for this conversation. But I think some of it as well is if we go back and understand the first century context a little better, I think it actually helps provide a better framework for how we can better engage the ethnic divides in our world today. Now, we'll talk about this some more this coming week, but in the first century, the temple in Jerusalem had a literal wall that was separating and dividing the Jewish side from the Gentile side. So Ephesians 2, when it talks about the dividing wall of hostility, this is the wall that they are talking about. And actually, some archaeological excavations have found signs on that wall that say Gentiles trespass or cross this line at your own. It's almost like those trespassing signs that you see. Trespassers will be shot on sight. So Gentiles, by crossing that wall, are taking their lives into their own hands. And it says that no one else is responsible for the death that is going to come upon you. So in that context, in that idea, Ephesians 2 talks about the dividing wall has been broken down because of Christ. Galatians 3:28 similarly says, there is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither slave nor free, there is no male or female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. So because of the salvation that has been given to us by Jesus Christ, that means we need to be united. Now, another piece that I talked about is the need for us to be careful to avoid using buzzwords. Things like CRT, Black Lives Matters, defund the police, whatever is the hottest, latest trend for people to be talking about. Now, I said that not because I'm afraid of digging into them. It's because they have become a way of simply stopping the conversation before you even have a chance to dig in and dialogue on these issues. For example, generally, when the word race is used, so racism, anything like that, it's easier to just jump to the conclusion, well, that's just critical race theory, instead of digging into the conversation further. Like, what do you mean by whatever you were saying? Another time, anytime someone says Black Lives Matter, the response of all lives matter doesn't help or spur someone on to edification. And I'll read a quote at the end here from Shai book, The New Reformation, where he talks about why it's not helpful just to use a phrase, a response like all lives matter. Now, all lives do matter. That's not up for debate. We have that, but we root it in the image of God, not in catchphrases. So these conversations, it's not that we're trying to shy away or get away from the truth. All of these are very difficult conversations with all sorts of various implications, applications, with not even bringing up the historical weight that many of these issues have. Now, I've shared this before as well. I think we as the church need to do a better job of speaking prophetically into our culture. Remember, prophetically isn't telling the future. It's reminding people how God created us to live. So John Perkins, I'll recommend a book of his a little bit later on here, has said, "There is no institution more equipped and capable of bringing transformation to the cause of reconciliation than the church. But we have some hard work to do." That's John Perkins, who has lived through a lot of the civil rights movement of the 40s, 50s, and 60s. His own personal testimony is his brother was killed by police officers. Now, with that said, one of the things I'd ask for all of you is I just have the question, what would help us as a congregation to do a better job of engaging on these issues? So one of the things I've thought is we have a class where we can dig through this issue a little bit further and more intentionally. Or maybe we have small groups start studying some intentional material about how we engage some of these very important issues. I've thought of trying to partner with some minority culture churches to pray or share resources with each other to encourage each other. I'd even like to do a trip with people from the church to visit Montgomery with me and visit the museum that I had the opportunity to go. So let me know if you're interested in something like that, but it's going to take all of us working together to come up with a picture, a way of engaging this issue differently than our world is offering right now. Now, I've recently talked to some pastors who have recently retired and have told me that they're so relieved that they're retired because they're not sure how they would engage the racial or ethnic divides today. They're not sure how they would engage the COVID and masking and vaccines and all of those people. And the reality is, every time I talk to them, I say they're not scary. The Bible gives us a framework for how we can engage all of them. Our job is to be a faithful presence in the times and seasons that God lays out for us. That's what we're trying to do. God determines our steps. God knows exactly when we are going to enter this world and when we're going to leave it. But what we have to do is be faithful. Now, I said I was going to share a little bit of a quote from Shai The New Reformation, and where he talks about why we shouldn't be colorblind as Christians. So here's what Shai says in that book. "The proper response is to thank God for it and leverage it for the glory of God. To my white brothers and sisters in Christ, please don't tell me that you don't see color. I know what you mean. You're trying to communicate that you treat all people equally and that you judge people based on the content of their character rather than the color of their skin. That's great. We should all do that. But God was intentional when he gave me brown skin. He didn't give it to me that it might be ignored. He gave it to me that it would be appreciated and that he might be praised for his creative genius. So don't rob God of his praise by ignoring it." I think that's a great thought and way to begin some of this dialogue and conversation. In Revelation 5, it talks about all tribes, tongues, and nations gathered around the throne. Now, you don't hear what they're saying, so that means that there are different ethnicities by their skin tone represented even when we get to heaven. However, remember what I've said before as well, that if it's diversity just for the sake of diversity, that is pointless, because even hell is diverse. So we need to be diverse because that's what God has called and commanded us to do, not for the end goal of diversity, but for the end goal of glorifying and honoring God with everything that we do and say. So with that said, a few resources that I'm going to recommend again. The first is The New Reformation by Shai, Finding Hope in the Fight for Ethnic Unity. I'm going to link to all of these resources in the email and in the YouTube description, so you should be able to just click on them and find them. There was also a podcast where he talked with someone about the contents in this book, so if you'd rather listen to the podcast first, you can do that. Second one, talking about race, Gospel Hope for Hard Conversations by Isaac Adams. I thought this one was helpful in approaching it more from a pastoral perspective. So what he does is he tells a story throughout the whole book of a lot of conversations I've had with people around me, and then he breaks down at the end of each chapter how he would counsel the two people in that story. There's also a podcast walking through this book that I will send out as well if you'd rather listen to that to get some kind of an overview of what the book says. Next one I mentioned on Sunday is called Weep With Me, How Lament Opens a Door for Racial Reconciliation by Mark Vergrop. One of the things that I really appreciated about this book is at the end of each chapter, he has a prayer of lament and how we as a church can engage and prayerfully approach some of these issues and difficult conversations. Next, this is Divided by Faith, an evangelical Religion and the Problem of Race in America by Michael Emerson and Christian Smith. It's a fairly old book, so I'm going to check when it came out here. 2000, so a few years old at this point, but they're sociologists who are looking at some of the implications for race in our world today and some of how history has affected and shaped the things that we see in the world around us. Next is called Beyond Racial Gridlock, Embracing Mutual Responsibility. You might recognize that phrase from my sermon on Sunday. This is by George Yancey. I also listened to, he spoke at our recent EFCA Theology Conference on some of the issues from there, as well as a new book that he has coming out. And so I'll link to the talk that he recently gave. You'll recognize some of the terminology that I used on Sunday from that talk. Lastly is another, I think, just helpful book. The foreword to this was written by John Perkins, and that is Confronting Injustice Without Compromising Truth, 12 Questions Christians Should Ask About Social Justice. Now, that's another one. The social justice has become a bit of a trigger word for many people today. Again, there's another talk. So he spoke at our recent EFCA Theology Conference as well, so you can go listen to the talk. It kind of walks through the contents of the book in, I think, a really helpful way. But I think it's more than just like reading things like this. I think it's digging in a little bit further. So I also looked up or found some videos that I think are helpful. So RightNow Media has a few different studies that I would recommend. One is Race and the Gospel by Brian Loritz and Matt Chandler, where they walk through Ephesians 2 and the implications for us today. Second one is Oneness Embraced by Tony Evans, where he is, again, talking through how we navigate some of these difficult pieces. And the third one is a more historical approach. It's called The Color of Compromise by Jamar Tisby. It's again, as a video. It's also a book that he has written where he does trace some of the implications of this racial divide that we have found in our country over the past 400 years. The other one is a two-part series that Phil Vischer did. You may know him better as the voice of Bob the Tomato. So he's a Minnesota guy, actually went to Crown College for a little while. I don't know if they claim him anymore or not, but he went there. So he did a two-part series, one that went viral titled Race in America, where he, again, traces some of the history, and he does it in a fairly condensed way, like 25 minutes or so. It's worth watching. And then he did a follow-up to some of the negative feedback that he got on his first video. So both of those are informative in just potentially giving you some more history that you may not be aware of. The last thing that I would encourage you to do, so getting to some of the learning aspect on the L of the engagement, is read some history about people who lived and walked through some of the segregation in the past, or even the slavery in the past 400 years of our country. So one that is very moving is Let Justice Roll Down by John Perkins. And so I quoted from him earlier, but his Let Justice Roll Down is his testimony of how God saved him. I'd encourage you to read something like The Narrative of Frederick Douglass by himself, telling how he came out of slavery. Read something like The Warmth of Other Suns by Isabel Wilkerson. It's a long story, history of the great migration of African Americans from the South to the North in the 20th century. But so these are just some starting points, some places. If you want to dig into this issue further, I'd encourage you digging into some of these resources. I can loan out some of these books to you. Some of them are free videos that you can access on your own time, but some of this is just a way for us to continue growing in our listening, lamenting, learning, and love. But don't forget, as 1 Corinthians 13 reminds us, the greatest of these is love. Now, if you've got further questions about this or want to talk further, as always, you can feel free to email me at any point you'd want, or we're going to be having another Q&A time at 9 o'clock upstairs on Sunday morning. We're going to wrap up this series this next week, walking through Ephesians Chapter 2, where we're going to, it's essentially the application of what the John Perkins quote that I shared. So again, I'm going to read that. There's no institution more equipped and capable of bringing transformation to the cause of reconciliation than the church. But we have some hard work to do. So let's dig into it together. Let's pursue reconciliation together, as Pastor Bruce regularly reminds us from 2 Corinthians chapter 5. God has given us the ministry of reconciliation. I'm looking forward to continuing this series with you next week. And again, if you have questions, feel free to reach out.